Good evening and welcome. My name is Mayor Jim Cowie, and welcome you here tonight. We're going to speak this evening on Public Pension Forum, and I just want to give you a quick overview of the format. I'm going to make some general comments. We're going to have four panelists give presentations on the subject, and then we're going to have comments, questions by you, the audience, and there are going to be runners here that will have cards. You can fill out the questions. They'll bring them up. And what we'll do is we'll try to make sure that we don't duplicate the questions. So that's the format for the evening. Let me begin with some general comments. Good evening and welcome to the City of Lake Forest Public Pension Forum. Tonight our distinguished panel will discuss the state of the current police and fire pension programs in Illinois. This is a complex situation, and our goal is not to develop a solution, but bring to light the various nuances of the system and how they relate to local governments, police and fire employees, and the taxpayer. Let me say first and foremost that Lake Forest supports its police and fire professionals, and preserving the public safety of its residents is of paramount concern to the City Council. As I stated earlier, Illinois pension funding is a complex and multifaceted issue. So let's take a look at the big picture. The public pension funding comes from three sources: employee contributions, employer contributions, and investment returns. An unparalleled decline in pension fund values and escalating costs have taken a toll on the funding of public employee pensions. Importantly, the Illinois General Assembly determines the amount of all pension benefits and employee contributions, not your local elected officials. However, the General Assembly does not provide any resources to pay for these pensions. By law, the city is mandated to fund pensions. Consequently, when the General Assembly votes to increase pension benefits for municipal employees, the city must allocate or generate funds for these unfunded mandates, and the City of Lake Forest has met this obligation year after year. Since employee contributions are capped by the General Assembly, the fiscal burden falls upon the city's contributions to keep these pension funds financially solvent. Our fire and police pension boards have made financially prudent efforts to maximize their investment returns under limitations imposed by the state in an effort to reduce the burden on taxpayers. But nevertheless, Lake Forest, like many communities across the state, has experienced an exponential increase in required contributions to fund public pensions. Additionally, steadily escalating pension costs have created fiscal challenges that are consuming an ever-increasing portion of the city's budget during an already challenging economic time. Although it is the city's responsibility to provide a reliable pension for public employees when they reach retirement age, state-mandated contribution increases are no longer feasible without new revenue sources or reductions in other city services, which puts municipal employee retirement security further at stake. This statewide situation threatens the long-term sustainability of the pension funds. Without legislative relief, Lake Forest and many other Illinois communities are faced with complex choices, which include budget cuts, deferred infrastructure improvements, or an increased burden on taxpayers to fund these pension benefits. On Election Day, February 2nd, the Lake Forest City Council has asked its constituents to consider an advisory referendum question to encourage the Illinois General Assembly and the governor to take immediate steps to implement meaningful pension reform. Again, let me reiterate, we value the hard work and dedication of our public safety officials. However, we must all work together to find solutions to address this growing concern. Tonight, our panel will inform our audience about the many aspects of this complex situation. Following the panel discussion, the questions and comments will be taken from the audience. To facilitate this process, we ask you to fill out a question card. Our runners will pick them up and we'll group like topics and submit the questions to our panel. And I'd like to welcome our panel. To my left is Alderman David Grumhouse, who chairs our Finance Committee. We have the Honorable State Senator Susan Garrett, Mike Havey from the Police Pension Board, and Mary Tominac, the Financial Advisor to the Fire Pension Board. At this time, we're going to have Alderman Grumhouse who will begin with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to come before you all tonight and address this very important topic. In my 5 years on the City Council and 4 years as head of the Finance Committee, this is certainly one of the most challenging issues we have faced. What makes it so hard is it is really an issue over which we, the City Council, have almost no control over. We certainly appreciate everyone coming together on this panel to try and work through these issues, and I especially appreciate Susan Garrett being here, who I know who's been working extremely hard in Springfield over the last 2 years to try and make some progress on this. Rosa, do you have slides? Can you move? Slide two. I thought I'd start by trying to provide some background on the city's finances. For 2011, and our fiscal year ends in April, so this will, beginning of May 2010, we expect to have minimal top-line revenue growth. This is largely the result of the economy, where we will see flat to down sales, income, and utility taxes, and lower development fees. We will also have minimal property tax increase growth because this is really set off of inflation, which obviously we're experiencing very little of. The expenses, however, are a different story. Our personnel costs make up 67% of our budget. So to really affect our expense line, that's really where the costs have to come out of. Within this, pension costs make up 12% of our expenses, and they will be up 25% for fiscal 11. This is obviously a very burdensome increase to have to deal with. The result of this is that we're going to have to cut $500,000 from our budget next year, and we are in the process of working through that as we go through the budget process in the coming months. Let me provide, on the next slide, let me provide a little bit more detail on the city's pensions. We have 3 pensions: the IMRF, police pension, and the fire pension. IMRF is run at the state level and covers all non-police and fire personnel. Police and fire pensions are run locally. It is important to note that the benefits and management of all 3 are dictated by the state. As the mayor said, this is not something that we as a city council set. As you can also see, police and fire have more generous benefit terms than IMRF, although they do require higher employee contributions. The next slide lays out the funding ratios for the 3 pensions currently and really gets to the crux of the issue that we are facing. In the past 10 years, funding levels for each of the 3 funds have fallen roughly 25% each. All 3 are now severely underfunded. IMRF is at 77%, fire is at 73%, and police is at 48%. The 3 drivers of pension funding are the benefits required, the investment returns, and the contributions made both by the city and the employees. I think it is important to look at what is driving the problem here. Clearly, a big driver has been poor investment returns, but that is not unexpected when you have a stock market that has shown negative returns over the past 10 years. I want to make it clear that the city has really benefited from the strong and conscientious pension boards, both police and fire. They have done a really good job of managing this money. And while I disagree with the idea of having each board manage their own money locally across the state, this has not been an issue for Lake Forest, other than the investment restrictions that are put on us and put on the boards in terms of how they can invest the money, and Mary will talk about this more later. I also think there are economies of scale that we lose, and lose across the state when each town and each public safety is managing their own money. But what's really been an issue for us is the overall pension terms awarded by the state, especially to police and fire. In a difficult economy and stock market, where the natural reaction should have been to curtail benefits, note the incredible changes we have seen in the private markets, in the private sector over the past 10 years. The legislature instead has only increased benefits. At some point, we need the legislature to say no more and realize they are really killing the finances of all the municipalities across the state. Next slide. The overall effect of this has been to greatly increase our pension cost per active employee. Note police costs have gone from $10,000 per employee in 1999 to almost $35,000 per active employee today. Next slide. Our pension costs as a percent of salary have also skyrocketed, with both police and fire more than doubling over the past 10 years. Next slide. One of the fallacies going around the state is that the pensions are in bad shape, because the cities are not making the necessary contributions that they're supposed to. As you will see here, Lake Forest has exceeded its actuarial mandated contributions every year, even though this has required huge increases in expenses for the city. I also want to be clear that this is a problem for all the cities across the state. As an example, within the Northwest Municipal Conference members, 28 of 29 cities face increased public safety contributions next year, with the average increase being $800,000. Looking here at some surrounding communities, you can see that Lake Forest is actually better off than most in terms of the increases that we're going to face next year. Last slide. This last slide just looks at the other state pensions and their funding levels. Perhaps it's hard to get the General Assembly to take our pension issues seriously when they have allowed this to become such a big issue for their pensions as well. Illinois now has the second lowest credit ratings in the United States, just behind California. Something truly has to be done, not only with the state pensions, but with our local pensions as well. Soon, the only recourse we will have will be to raise taxes or jeopardize our public safety by having to cut personnel in our police and fire departments. These are not options that I think anyone wants to face. That's all I have. I guess I will turn it over to Susan.
Uh-oh, I'm in the hot seat. Well, I'm honored to be here, and thank everybody in the audience for coming. This is a very important issue, not just here in Lake Forest. Other communities, other suburban communities are having these same kinds of discussions. Certainly at the state level, not a week goes by when we're in session or a day goes by that we don't really talk about pensions. From what I understand, there will be a large pension reform bill that will come up for a vote this coming session. I will be in Springfield tomorrow, so our session officially starts tomorrow. Public pensions and Medicaid in the state of Illinois are our fastest growing out of control expenditures. These are two areas that it's very difficult to really come up with a solution that takes care of all of the different constituencies. And as the mayor has already pointed out, this isn't an us against them situation. In order for us to really accomplish something, either tonight or long term, we all have to come together and come up with a remedy that doesn't just bias one side or the other, but that we come up with something where there's some sort of consensus. And that's what we've been trying to do in Springfield. It's just sometimes difficult. So I'm going to put out a few facts for you just to let you know, as we're talking about the local pension situation like Forest, the pensions in the state of Illinois are also extremely problematic, and I know that you know that. But and by the way, I just came back from California, and they nonstop are talking about their budget deficit, and many would say that that's primarily due to their out-of-control pension situation. So what I'd like to point out is that our pension payment this year is $4 billion. We have to borrow that money to make that pension payment. That's a fact. And even with some of the reforms that we are going to put in place as we start moving forward from 2010 through 2045, the percentage of the dollars of the pension payment, we're going to start, for instance, this year at $4 billion. The next year it's $5 billion. By 2045, it's $23 billion. But the percentage of the total revenue that we are going to be paying for our pension obligations is about anywhere between 18 to almost 20%. And that's just pensions. And when you look at the state budget and you look at healthcare, Medicaid, education, you name it, there just aren't enough dollars to pay all of the to make all of the payments that we need to make, the obligations that we have in place. And certainly pensions is really at the top of the list. So what we're talking about in Springfield is to come up with a two-tiered pension system. And basically, and very simply, that would mean that as we move forward, the current employees that are already in a program would not be affected. But moving forward, any new hire would not be possibly receiving the same type of benefits, or they may make a higher contribution level. And, in all fairness, this hasn't been met with a lot of enthusiasm by state employees, even the current state employees, or, as an example, retired, I'll say, teachers. And so we're trying to be fair about this and understand and try to communicate and educate everybody that Illinois may not have a choice. We, along with 49 other states, have to make the kinds of changes, and hopefully they won't be looked at as cuts, but reduce benefits. Businesses across the country, as you know, they've been forced into this too. They have to have a balanced balance sheet at the end of the year, and we as a state should be able to do the same thing. Since I've been in office, our biggest problem every year when it comes to the budget has been trying to resolve the pension payment. So I actually am looking forward to working with the leaders in the state, the citizens of the state, to make sure that we come up with something, and we can't keep putting it off. One of the arguments that we hear as why we don't really need to do anything now is it won't really have any impact for years to come. But I've been in office 12 years. I've been hearing that argument every year, and sooner or later we have to start. So I'm willing to roll up my sleeves, and I'm happy to answer your questions. And that's sort of the state of the state when it comes to pensions in Illinois.
Okay, good evening. My name is Mike Havey. I'm the president of the Police Pension Fund here in Lake Forest. And I want to thank and welcome everyone for giving up their Monday night. I just want to start out addressing one thing to the residents, and that is I think you all have to be really proud of your public safety officers you have here, both police and fire. I know almost all of them personally, and they are probably the most dedicated, the most educated and highly trained people I've met. And I think all of this hard work that all of us are doing is really to their benefit, and I think we should all be proud that they're serving us. I also want to take a moment too just to recognize the hardworking board members we have on both boards that have done such a great job working under really difficult conditions, trying to keep our funds, I don't want to say afloat, but keep them in positive territory during trying times. So what I'd like to do first is just go over kind of what our local board function is and what we do as a local board. And then I'll get into just a quick PowerPoint presentation on some of the challenges that we have specifically. Like I said, I'm actually on the Police Pension Fund, and I'm also going to speak a little bit tonight and represent the Fire Fund also, which my expertise is really not in the fire area, but our funds makeup and requirements from the state are very close. So I think if I talk about the Police Fund here, a lot of that will carry over onto the fire side. So basically, the local police and fire pension boards really have 5 specific goals. One is to administer all pensions, and that's to take in the new hires from when they're first hired by the city all the way through duty pensions and disability pensions. We hear hearings for officers or firefighters that might be disabled. So all of the administrative end of the pensions. We interview and hire money managers and investment consultants to advise us on how to invest and handle the money and make sure that we're doing that all within state statutes and guidelines. We draft and adopt and amend our investment policies, rules of the board, and fiduciary responsibilities of the board. We also provide mandatory ethics training for board members and ensure that state requirements are met. The state laws change almost every year as far as what boards need to do and what our fiduciary responsibilities are. And this last item, the mandatory ethics training, has really been a big law that's been enacted in the last year by Governor Quinn, and it really requires a lot of time of the volunteer board members to keep up on this training. As Mayor Cowie stated earlier, there's 3 sources of revenues that our funds receive: the tax levy contributions collected by the city, the contributions made by members, which incidentally is just under 10% of their salary, and then interest and returns on investments. The makeup of our local fire and police boards are mandated by the state. Any city or village with a population of 5,000 or more is mandated to have their own local board. Both our police and fire pension boards were formed in 1941, and both of our boards are identical in makeup. And what I mean by that is 2 active members of the fire department and 2 active members of the police department are elected by the entire membership to serve on the board. 1 retired member from each side is elected by the retired membership to serve on the board. And then there's 2 mayoral appointees that serve on the board. And I will say that the city of Lake Forest has done an excellent job in providing both boards with local residents that are money managers and money professionals by profession that volunteer and serve and advise us. And they've just been fantastic on both boards. The terms are slightly different. On the fire board, those members serve 3-year terms, and on the police board, we serve 2-year terms. We both elect our officers of the board every year, and like every other board in the city of Lake Forest, we are all volunteers and we receive no compensation. So having said that, I'll move on to some of the specific problems that, again, are facing our pension funds. Again, taking into account that this is mostly slanted toward the police side, again, because that's where I'm the most familiar with. So the first slide here, there's nothing new here. I think we all know that the pension system needs some type of reform. We cannot continue currently at the rate we are. There's no single factor that has caused this, and there's no magic bullet or silver bullet that's going to solve the problem. Our police pension and fire plan is heavily regulated by the state and affords our local board very little latitude. We're mandated as to the makeup of our board, we're mandated as to what instruments we can invest in, and we're mandated as to what benefits we must provide. Next slide, please. And actually, I'm going to skip over this because I'm going to address this in another slide. Okay, currently this is the pension structure. There's a couple nuances here that the fire side doesn't have, which I'll talk about in a minute, but for both, the full pension can be received at age 50 and 20 years of service. That pension would equate out to 50% of that member's last day's salary. The pension can be increased up to 75% of their salary with 30 years of service. This is one of the differences between police and fire. In police, on day 1, a officer is vested for a non-duty disability, whereas on the fire side, it's 7 years. That's important to remember. I'll come back and address that in a minute. But the other thing is, Alderman Grumhouse talked a little bit about IMRF and how their funding rates are a little lower, their benefits aren't quite as high. The one difference is IMRF members receive Social Security. Our police and firemen here are not eligible for Social Security. This pension that they receive is the only thing they have on retirement. Our local police pension plan currently has 41 active members that contribute to the plan, and we have 34 beneficiaries currently receiving pensions. On the fire side, they have 33 active members and 28 retired members receiving benefits. The average age of our active participant in our pension fund is 39.7 years of age. We have 31 participants in our police pension plan between the ages of 35 and 50. If you look at those figures closely, that kind of tells us that our police pension fund could be heavily impacted in the coming years when we have such a high percentage of our membership nearing retirement. Our specific pension plan took a huge hit several years ago because we had 5 active members retire in 1 year. 3 of these were high net pensions. 2 were police commanders and 1 was our police chief. And for a pension fund our size, this is a huge hit in 1 year. What happens is if you look at the 10% that these employees put in, if you have a police chief that's making the top pay scale, he's putting 10% in, and equate that out into these 5 members we had leave, they're being backfilled by newer officers that come in at maybe half or lesser percentage, feeding their contributions into the pension fund. Our specific fund has also received several pension spikes over the past years that have been used as incentives for employees for early retirement. That burden of a pension spike falls solely on our pension fund. So in other words, that has no backlash to the city in any way. That's straight out of the pension fund. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, the other problem we have is the contributions are based on actuarial data. And a lot of the actuarial assumptions that we use really need to be adjusted. We're still operating on actuarial assumptions and tables that were implemented in 1971, which assumes the average retirement age of a police officer is 62 years old. I can tell you in Lake Forest, as far back as I looked, we've never had anywhere near that age retiring. Our average age of retirement is a little over 55 years of age, with the majority of them coming right after age 50. It also looks at returns on our investment on a consistent basis, a yearly consistent basis of 7.5%. And we go back to what I talked about, state mandates of what we can invest in. Up until the year 2000, we could only invest in fixed income. As of 2000, we've been able to invest slightly in equities, and Mary will talk a little bit to this. We're able to invest up to 45% of our portfolio in equities. So you all know what your CDs have done in your savings account, and for us to try to get 7.5% on a consistent basis, being mostly in fixed income, is not going to happen. And that's basically where a lot of our data is based on these figures. The other thing too is in the equities we can invest in, we're restricted in what we can invest in. We can't invest in any foreign companies, any companies that have any foreign ownership, any ADRs. So if we wanted to buy stock in BP Amoco or any other company like that, we just can't do it. Okay, I talked about what we're mandated as far as benefits and so forth. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, one of the other issues that we've had and one of the other problems we've had is what they call pension portability. And what that does is that allows an officer to go to another police department, and if he worked in Lake Forest, let's say for 4 years, and he served 26 years at a different police department, he could go back and buy back his 4 years of service at Lake Forest to be able to bring his full service years up to 30, again, to get that 75% pension I talked about. And I'm going to give you just one specific case, so if you can just follow me for a minute on this. This involved a police officer that worked for Lake Forest from January of 1977 to March of 79. I know this is an old thing, but just follow me on this. His total contributions to our pension fund was $2,954. He resigned to take a position with the Aurora Police Department, and we refunded his entire amount. So if a police officer or fire leaves prior to 20 years, he gets all of his contributions back. He completed 26 years of service in Aurora, and the portability law allowed him to buy back an additional 2 years of service through Lake Forest. So in the year 2007, he was able to buy back those 2 years at Lake Forest. His responsibility to our fund was to return his $2,954 plus 6% interest from 1979. So his total payback to our fund was $13,709. In turn, we had to refund money to the Aurora Police Pension Fund, and our liability to Aurora was $30,998, or a difference of $17,000 that our fund had to absorb. So pension portability is great for the beneficiary or the member, but that should have to be funded 100% by the member and not take the hit from the local pension fund. Okay, so in closing, there's some solutions and some areas that we really need to look at. I think the cities and villages need to contribute at the funding level that's specified by the Department of Insurance. I think we need to allow more investment options and give local boards more discretion in investment instruments. We need to look at the possibility of modifying benefits for new candidates entering the pension funds through a two-tiered system, such as what Susan described. But I want to be careful when I mention two-tiered system, because that will not affect any pension member that's already in the system or any employee that's already paying into our current system. This would be for new hires coming in after a date certain. The actuarial assumptions, which our funding is based on, needs to be adjusted to reasonable levels. And we need to eliminate pension spikes and modify our non-duty related disability benefit. If I go back to that first slide that I showed where you could have a non-duty disability with 1 day of service, that means I could start working for the Lake Forest Police Department today. I could go up to northern Wisconsin and hit a tree on a snowmobile and permanently be disabled, and our pension fund would have to pick up that benefit for the rest of that officer's life. A duty-related disability should be covered from day one, no questions asked, and it is right now. But I think from the police side, at least, we need to look at having some kind of milestone pass before that non-duty disability kicks in. On the fire side, it is 7 years of credible service. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on is what I just addressed, and that's pension portability needs to be funded 100% by the members. So thank you very much for your time and your interest in this matter.
Just a quick before Mary starts, as I was asked to remind the audience, so if you do have questions, please get them to the runners so we can get them up here in time and not have waiting in between questions. So thank you, and Mary.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to have served the city for many years. I'm also a resident of the city of Lake Forest, so I take an extra special. You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Better. I was saying that I'm also a resident of the city of Lake Forest, so I take additional interest in this topic. My presentation tonight, I'm going to be sharing with you some additional information on what has caused this underfunding problem that we're dealing with. Also, to share with you some of the complexities we're facing on the investment side as they relate to pension plans here in Illinois. And then some thoughts on some areas for improvement. So if we could switch the slide, please. How did we get here? And the next one, please. Great. As I think it's been mentioned more than once tonight, there are three basic components that impact pension funding levels. How much is contributed both by the employer and the employees, how much is paid out in terms of benefits, and what the city can earn on the investments in the plan. And any one of these alone going in the wrong direction can impact, and in some cases very significantly, the funding levels. So if you don't put enough money in, or pay out too much in benefits, or earn too little, it all will drive the problem and make it worse. The next page, please. I have here a quote from a book that was recently published, and it's really an excellent resource. Each chapter was written by a different expert in the public pension arena. M. Barton Waring, his chapter is titled Improving the Cost Effectiveness of Public Pensions. And he tells us that falling interest rates and falling equity markets are the two worst things for pension plan financial health, and both are happening simultaneously at present. Clearly, the investment returns have been one contributor to the funding issue. Let's take a look, if you will, at what's been going on for the past 10 years and how it relates to the choices that boards have had with Illinois Police and Fire pension funds. Now, this chart that I have up here illustrates the historical returns of two indices with varying mixes of stocks and bonds for various time periods going back, as I say, 10 years. Now, as Mike mentioned, Illinois Pension Code requires 55% of plan assets to be in fixed income investments, primarily government bonds. So we've represented the return of the equity markets by the index, the Standard & Poor's 500. As you can see on the left, that's the top one, S&P 500. The next one is the Barclays Government Bond Index, or it's abbreviated BC Government Bond Index. And these are two broad representations of the major asset classes for Illinois Police and Fire pension funds. If you go to the far right, to the 10-year column, you can see that the government bond index has handily beat the returns for stocks. And these are average annual returns going back 10 years. And it's by a significant margin, roughly 8 percentage points. And if you continue to look at that column on the right-hand side, you can see that even the best mix, which would have been 100% in government bonds, underperform most boards' actuarial assumed rates of return. And as Mike was mentioning earlier, whether that number is 7 or 7.5 or 8, it's been a daunting number to reach in the best case scenario. As you can see, looking at the various mixes, which I would say probably the bottom 3 were ones that were actively pursued by boards within the state. You can see that it's been very problematic to obtain those investment returns that were needed that in turn impact the funding levels because of the way the calculations are created for the contribution. So pension boards' asset allocation decisions have impacted the investment returns and then in turn the funding levels. The next slide, please. The next chart is based on research from a firm in Wisconsin, Red Granite Advisors. And the top chart shows the returns of the S&P 500 from 1965 to approximately 1981. And you can see it's a lot of up and down, that's fairly obvious. But also of note is pretty much where it started is where it ended. There weren't a lot of gains to be made. The bottom chart shows you the returns from 82, for the buy and hold investor, that is. From 1982 to the present, represented by the bottom chart, you could see it was quite a bit different in terms of the trend, and it was pretty much up for about 20 years until we hit July of 2000. So the trend lately appears to be more choppy again, and with a lot of volatility. And I have to share with you that volatility is not a friend of pension funding levels, and good ones, that is. So this represents potentially increasingly complex investment environment for pension funds and their boards. If we go to the next chart, we see the dollar amounts of the annual contributions that the city has made to the 3 pension plans for the past 5 years. And as was mentioned before, the city has been diligent about making the required contributions. And the column to the right with the IMRF also includes amounts that were paid to Social Security on behalf of those employees. So what you can see in looking at these numbers, obviously they've increased dramatically, and I have the percentages at the bottom. But there is some variability within the increase, and the variability can be tied to a number of items, including salary increases, benefit increases, and of course, investment returns. If we go to the next slide, there are many components to this area of investment returns, and the success of them, if you will. We discussed the impact of the capital markets and on funding levels, but there are 3 items that are definitely controllable, and one is the asset allocation. And as we saw in looking at the returns of the indices, there was wide variability in terms of the best performing versus the various mixes. The process can also be controlled, and it has been important for boards to work with professionals to help navigate these complexities of the capital markets and provide oversight. Certainly, last but not least, are fees. And it's critical that competitive fee levels be pursued, particularly in the low return environment. And this item, as you can see, is also something that's controllable. If we go to the next page, Mike mentioned, and Susan Garrett, recent pension reform that has happened particularly in the past couple of years. And we feel that this has been very successful in raising the bar for boards and service providers. So this is definitely a very good step. Mike mentioned the training that's now required of board members. We have ethics reform, and we have oversight in terms of review of investment managers and consultants. Fiduciary role has been defined and expanded to include consultants as well as investment advisors. We have much more, we have clearer and much more transparent reporting for you as citizens, and prohibition on placement fees. So these are all very, very positive steps. When we go to the next slide, and what's facing us now is what the future holds. And the question for us as residents is, shall the Illinois General Assembly and the governor take immediate steps to implement meaningful pension reform, which will relieve the unsustainable burden on local taxpayers? This is a very complex question, as we've heard before. And we as taxpayers, changing hats here, should give serious consideration to all of the issues. And reform can come in many shapes and sizes, some of which has been mentioned. Certainly the contribution levels of the employer and the employees, the actuarial methodology, but we must also consider some of the indirect consequences that could come from pension reform. And I must share with you that about 5 years ago, Allie Tomanek, my 3-year-old daughter at the time, and I were in a very serious accident where my car was totaled. I was in the city of Lake Forest and was able to rely upon the care that was provided to me by our emergency service and the fire department. And they took very good care of us, and I had complete confidence in their ability to do so. Recently, I was able to catch up at the Lake Forester and noticed there was a serious fire at former Mayor Frank Farwell's home on December 30th. Flames in the southeast corner, I'm quoting from Pioneer Press, southeast corner of the rambling 2-story farm home crews were being fought by one crew, and crews began removing items from the home and salvaging items valued at $2 million. In the course of fighting the fire, One firefighter was injured, his back was injured, and taken to a hospital and subsequently released. For us as citizens of the city of Lake Forest, what price, we must ask ourselves, what price are we willing to pay, if need be, for the quality of care that we have had on the part of our police and firefighters? What is that worth to us? And it may be worth something different to each and every one of us. But before we go and answer this question on the upcoming ballot, we must certainly give it consideration that it is not simple, and there are many issues that must be taken into account. Changing hats again, back to investments. There can be much improvement to increase the diversification and flexibility of plan investments, and I'm going to touch on this a bit more. But the bottom line of this chart is I would encourage advocates of pension reform to obtain a copy of the book I mentioned earlier, The Future of Public Employee Retirement Systems, because experience has shown we are not the first, as Susan Garrett mentioned, we are not the first state to face this issue. There are many that have come before us. And not all quote-unquote solutions, if you will, are cost-effective for taxpayers. And many have and could lead to unintended consequences that, as we contemplate pension reform, need to be at least considered and potentially avoided. If we go to the next slide, I'd like to finish with a few thoughts on asset allocation. This is a study that was done by Watson Wyatt in 2009, the Global Pension Asset Survey. And what we have here are a list of asset allocations of pension plans, not only in the US, but throughout the world. And as you will recall, 55% of Illinois Police and Fire Pension Fund assets are required to be invested in government bonds. And that rate of return at the end of September, because that's when we have the most updated data, was 2.12% for the Barclays Government Bond Index. Now it's a little bit higher, and it may go higher still, but as you can see, with 55% required to be invested at 2% and change, it's a very, very difficult bogey to reach 7 to 8%. This is not a requirement of IMRF, which was the other group of pension information that I had presented earlier, and it's not required of pension funds in general, whereby if you look at this top chart, they have elected or chose to invest approximately 30% in bonds, of which corporate bonds, government bonds, all are included in the mix. So, in conclusion, is it broken? No, I don't feel so. But can improvements be made? You betcha. Improvements can be made to not only increase the flexibility, but broaden the investment choices for trustees to help combat the complexities of the capital markets and access a broader range of managers and strategies. That's all I have. I'd like to say thank you again and hope that we could all work together to come up with a resolution to this very daunting issue. Thank you.
I want to thank our panel this evening for all your insight. And as you can see, that we are dealing with a very complex issue and one that we don't have a real clear-cut answer to. But I think the object, at least for this evening, was to inform you, to educate you, and give you a little more insight into the complexity of the problem. We're happy to entertain questions at this time. And I'll do my best to read your writing, because if it's like mine, we're all in trouble. But first question I have is, can you discuss how the other municipal employees' pension IMRF has been affected by the economy and what the city proposed to do about the unsustainable burden that IMRF imposes upon the residents of the city of Lake Forest. And I'm going to leave this open to any one of our panelists to see who may have a clearer insight. Alderman Grumhouse?
I'll take a shot at it. You know, if you look at the chart, IMRF was 100%, was 99% funded in 2007. So it's obviously had a drop down this year. Having said that, the benefits that it gives are significantly lower than the other two funds. And because it is a state-paid fund, run at the state level and combined, they obviously had the opportunity, as Mary was saying, to invest in a whole lot of different assets and spread their money around. My guess is they are significantly more heavily invested in equities, so my guess is we will see a better rebound in that fund this year than the other funds. So, you know, it is a problem. I'm not denying that it's a problem. It's not the same level of problem that we're facing in the other two funds. And because of the different benefits, it won't grow as fast as the other two funds. I also think that, you know, one of the issues we deal with police and fire is, you know, we have a public safety issue, and you all know that. And you know, we can cut services a lot easier in IMRF. You know, there are things that we are looking at and doing on that side of the business. It's a lot tougher on police and fire because we know there are minimum levels of officers that we need on call at all times. So, you know, I think we have a little bit more flexibility with the larger pool and asking citizens to give up certain services. It's a lot harder to ask them to give up police and fire. So I don't believe that the issue is as bad with that as with the other two funds.
Thank you, Alderman Grumhouse. The next question I have is, if policemen and firemen are not covered by Social Security, is this their only retirement plan? And a further to that is, can they also contribute to 401s or 457s? Mike?
Yes, the police and fire are not eligible for Social Security. This is their only income stream. The pension, there is a deferred compensation plan, which is voluntary, that they can contribute to, but that's all self-funded, so there's no matching funds, so to speak, as far as any 401k or anything along those lines.
Up until as long as they're still working as police and fire, right? I mean, if they retire at 51 and go work in other employment, can they take Social Security from that and 401k from that and make those contributions?
If they hit the minimum requirements for Social Security. Yeah, like if they were to start a second career or
Right.
another job, yes. The other thing too, I just wanted to add to that, there is some misconception that when the police and fire personnel retire, that part of their benefit package is medical paid up for life, or that their medical insurance is paid for, and that's not part of the mix at all. In a lot of cases, if they stay on the city medical plan, that can consume up to 1/3 or in some cases more of their pension. So medical and any other benefit is not included at all in these pensions.
Thank you, Mike. The next question I have is, please explain how benefit enhancements are approved, and why can't we just reduce benefits like in the private sector? Good one.
It goes back to what we talked about before, is that we're mandated by the state. We, as a local board, we cannot alter any type of benefit package. We can't deviate whatsoever from the state mandate of how we run the board, what benefits we will hand out or allow. It's very cut and dry. There's very little latitude from a local level.
So without that reform, we could not alter a plan. That's just
No.
simply the way it is.
Exactly.
I assume-
We couldn't make any change whatsoever. And the other misconception is because Lake Forest is home rule, we can maybe circumvent that somehow, and that's not the case. Home rule has no effect on the state mandated pension plans for police and fire.
Thank you, Mike. The next question I have is there, and this is in quotation, stacking of pensions, local, county, state, and Illinois? And the follow-up to that is, should there be one general pension system for all public employees in Illinois? I guess it's a policy question. I don't know, Susan, does that make any more sense for you? I don't want to,
Well, one of the things I've learned in my office is that municipality schools like local control. And for the state to run all of the pensions, I think would be problematic for many of the municipalities. But we could ask, the municipalities to weigh in on that at some point in time. But from what I heard tonight, you do like the way you administer these pensions and run them, and you have the local participants from the community. I think that's a lot different than having Springfield do it on your behalf.
I think the issue that comes in from my perspective is I think for a town like Lake Forest, we do like running it locally. The issue is, I think when the General Assembly goes to sets the rules, they have to look at all the cities around the state. And as a result of that, we have very educated fire and police officers, and we have very good advisors that are serving on those boards. And so I think we have pretty sophisticated boards, and I think we have strong advisors. I think that's not necessarily the case around the state. And so when the legislature, the General Assembly, goes to sets the rules and sets the investment decisions, I think they have to set very strict parameters, and as a result of that, they really restrict the investments that we can make. So to me, if the choice is to run it locally and be restricted to 45% equity and only invest in single A bonds or government bonds and not be able to invest in foreign securities versus setting up more of an IMRF system where we can invest across the board, we can invest in commodities, we can invest any way we want to. The state, someone can invest that way for us. I think the latter is going to be a lot better way to do it. So, I think there's a trade-off there. And I know one of the things we had talked about a few years ago was for communities of a certain size or a certain sophistication level, would they be able to maybe invest in money a little bit more freely? But again, that's probably something that's hard to write legislatively.
And so I think what you're saying is absolutely correct in a city like Lake Forest, but not all cities in the state would have the discipline and the
Right.
integrity that the city of Lake Forest has. And so it should apply across the board, but unfortunately there aren't the same types of, as I try to say, integrity within those communities. And we've had problems with communities mismanaging their own local pension funds.
And so then I think, when you look at sort of the IMRF system, I think that's something that needs to be looked
Yeah,
at.
no, that's a good point.
But I think I would take maybe the counter to that, and that is, I think from an investment standpoint, there would be some economies of scale to pool monies together, but I would be very leery to lose control of our funds locally. And again, I think the state, and not only our state, but other states have shown how they handle pension funds and sometimes dip into them for balancing other accounts, and I think I would just be very concerned about losing local control over, basically, it's our money. Now, whether there might be some way to co-op our money, whether the police and fire pensions of maybe 10 other communities can band together and find investment vehicles, that might be an option that I would be open to, but losing any kind of control over these funds, which are sizable, I would have a concern with.
Oh, I had one comment. I know that there has been some banding together of municipalities to create investment vehicles, and it's been a very worthwhile process. One of them that comes to mind is the Illinois Metropolitan Investment Fund, which is a short-term bond fund, if you will, where the asset size is roughly 250 or 300 million. It's been a great vehicle, and there's been reduced fees because of the level of participation. So there may be other choices along that line. You bring up a good point.
thank you. The next question I have is, what is the unfunded obligation or deficit for Lake Forest of the 3 pensions in question? David, do you know the?
I don't think I have that with me. Bob, do you have that by any chance?
This is asking for unfunded obligation. Are we- Okay. And just,
And I'm sure IMRF is the biggest obligation because they've got by far the most employees.
yeah, and Susan, I'm gonna ask you, because I don't know if
Yeah,
this
it's-
is correct,
It's
but,
in the 400 billion.
yeah,
It's
because I received,
gigantic when you combine all the funds
I
together.
received an email today from one of your fellow senators. It was a newsletter that I get on a regular basis, and her comment was that, I believe that there is $80 billion in unfunded pensions in the state of Illinois right now? Is that?
Yeah, but you combine other funds and you.
Right,
could
they're not
even
just police and
jack it
fire
up
we're
more.
speaking of,
Mhm.
so.
That's
Let me
It's
go to the next
astronomical.
question. Next question is our city the only one in Illinois working on the advisory question of meaningful pension reform? And I know I can answer that one as no. I know Barrington is putting this on their, the February 2nd ballot as well. Is that correct, Bob? And I do believe there are many other communities that were certainly in discussion in that matter. I don't know how many have formally been able to get it on the ballot. Is that just the two? So that's as much as, anyone, do you have any other information,
I'd like to
Susan?
sort of pipe in here. The Northwest Municipal Conference, and I know there are a couple of representatives here tonight. Every year we have a legislative breakfast, and several mayors and city managers from a multitude of different communities attend that. And I think and Bob Kiley has been in attendance for at least the last 5 years. Every single time we have this breakfast, which is scheduled in February, the whole notion of this pension situation comes up. And, you know, mayors from Des Plaines to Lake Forest to Highland Park, Barrington, and everything in between, every community in between have the same concerns. So while they may not be putting it on the ballot, because it's tricky, it's hard, you have to do it in a certain period of time, they are very, very concerned.
Right. And I would echo that same comment. I know we had a lot of discussion at the city council level as to, you know, how to get this information out, and are really, by putting it on the ballot, that's why we're here tonight, and we're trying to do this publicly, and it's not just for the service of Lake Forest. I know there's I see other mayors here from local communities. We have the mayor of Highwood here. I saw you're walking the door, Charlie. So I know there's other people here that also have the same issues in local communities, and they're all trying to get the word out. So basically, we're here to educate and inform. The next question I have, this is actually for you, Susan Garrett. How many yes votes will be required, and I'm not quite sure here, on the referendum to get the state legislators to act?
Well, the way I understand, this is an advisory referendum, and if 70% of those that vote in February, as an example, say that they are in agreement with this referendum idea, what that really does is send a message to legislators such as myself that we have to act, we have to do something. And this is not news to us. We know that we probably should have been acting years ago. But I do believe that there is going to be a pension reform, a major pension reform bill. That's what I've been led to believe. And I do think that all of the input that we're hearing, even tonight, things I never even thought of, these are actually very good discussions, because I can take this information back with me to Springfield, and as they put this, as they call it now, a wedding cake of pension reform together, we can add to it. You know, we can provide the kind of input that will be positive for our communities here on the North Shore.
Thank you. The next question I have is, can you explain the benefits that the firefighters, police officers don't get, in parentheses, Social Security, and how this will or won't be affected by a two-tier system? The second part of this question is, has a study been completed to determine the possible cost savings between the current system and a two-tier system? I don't know if anybody could, Mike?
Well, yeah, I think it would depend on what type of two-tier system is enacted. You know, I think it's something that needs to be looked at, but I think it's premature for any of us to say the two-tiered system is the way to go. Basically, the general premise would be that current pension beneficiaries and current police officers and firefighters in the system would receive the same benefits that they were, I don't want to say guaranteed, but what they signed up for when they started with a city or a village. Any new officers coming in would have, let's say, lesser benefits. And what I mean by that is maybe some of the ideas would be instead of getting a full pension at age 50 and 20 years of service, maybe you have to go to age 55 and 25 years of service, or some combination thereof. And these are all things that would have to be looked at. And so until you know exactly what type of two-tier system would be enacted, there's no way to know what the cost savings would be and what the exact benefits would be. But I think the main thing is that moving forward, under the current circumstances, something has to give. We can't continue the same benefits with the same investment guidelines, with the same money or lack thereof coming in. It's just not working. And that's one possible solution, or one cog in the whole wheel that needs to be looked at.
I'm going to follow up with this one real quick because Rosie just gave it to me, and it's basically a good follow-up. What is the downside of a two-tiered pension system?
Well, the downside would be a new, one of the great things about our pension plans is that it attracts really qualified, great candidates. And this city, which I'm a resident, all of us are residents of, enjoy excellent public safety. And so in order to entice these men to take this job, one of the great benefits is the pension. So the downside of having a lesser pension is the newer candidates coming in may not have the same benefits, may not enjoy the same things that the current people do. But it's been my experience in one of my former boards when I was on the Police and Fire Commission in this town, that there are so many young men and women that want to get into this field that if the pension is slightly different, that's not going to turn them off from coming. The one thing that I talk about that, again, this is just my personal feeling, is that a lot of these pensions were evolved from back in the 60s and the 70s, when really nobody wanted to be a policeman or a fireman or a postal worker. You know, these were jobs that you needed a good pension, good benefits to try to entice people to do it. Now the pay has come up, the training has come up, the equipment has come up, and it's really looked at in our society as an honorable job, and I think we don't have the same problems attracting qualified people that maybe they had back when these pensions were first envisioned.
Thank you. The next question I have is, will this pension crisis go away if the stock market improves and investment returns increase? Oh, okay, Mary, you look like you have a thought there.
Will the pension crisis go away? No, but it'd be obviously a lot less problematic. We have a long way to go to make up for the damage that's been done. So it's one thing for it to go away, but it's another to get the outsized returns that we started to get, say, back in 1982. And part of it also is for interest rates to rise, and that's another whole set of issues that we could be here all night discussing. So with 55% of the assets earning 2-3% at best, it's really tough, even with a good stock market, to try and hit that 7% bogey. So there are other things that need to be done. I think flexibility as far as the investments go. We've had multiple money managers refuse to work with Illinois Police and Fire Funds because of the very, very difficult, complex nuances of the law. So there are quality managers that have shunned us. So there are definitely things that we can do to help from that perspective too.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
So if the stock market goes up, that would be great, and interest rates increase, that would be great. But the revenues, the tax revenues that, for instance, the city of Lake Forest potentially will be bringing in, and certainly the state of Illinois will be bringing in, they aren't forecasted to really go up. And we have to pay from the revenues this pension obligation. So until we start seeing the revenues from sales tax or whatever continue to start go up, we'll have less money to pay into that pension obligation. So it's like a double negative. So it's not just the stock market, and maybe they're correlated.
Sure, there's just so many pieces to that
Yeah.
system, and it's also, based on, driven by the economic times and the cycles that you go through as well. So it's a myriad parts to it that make it difficult.
And we have to pay in. I mean, we don't have the obligation to skip our funding. We have to pay in, and, it's this year, we have to pay in, so we've got to find $500,000, so we've got to go out and we've got to cut services to make up that $500,000. And that's what we're going to have to do every year, because we got no other way to do it.
And I will say, though, Lake Forest being very fiscally conservative, we're in a actually a fairly good situation. There are numerous communities, though, that have relied on, as Susan Garrett had talked about a minute ago, sales tax revenues and the like, and many of them that had, especially the ones that have a lot of car dealerships or car dealerships that have closed, and those sales tax have gone away. And now they're confronted again with these huge pension costs have really taken double whammies. So you're absolutely right. Let me try another one here, and it's, to what extent are salaries manipulated in the calculation years prior to retirement? That is, what is the average rate of salary growth in the last year or two prior to retirement?
I don't know the exact answer to that question. I didn't really do a study, and to be quite honest, I don't know if we're really purview to all the personal action reports of the city, but I will say our particular fund has experienced what we call pension spikes, and what that is, it's not anything under the table or illegal or anything else. It's when an employee, it can be used as an enticement for an employee to take early retirement. And the issue is that when that spike does come through, that affects that member's or participant's pension. So as we talked earlier, he gets his last year's salary, whether it's 50% of his salary or 70%, 75% of his salary, whatever that spike or that payroll was going out, that's what we have to pay on. I don't know the number. It's not a huge problem. It's just if it happens a few times on a fund our size where there's only 41 participants, it can have negative impacts.
Thank you. I have about 3 or 4 more left, and I'll do is try to wrap these up, and then I think our time is going to be pretty much allotted. But let me try this one. Is yesterday on WGN 780, Dan Hines, who was running for governor, unequivocally rejected a pension reform as basic as a 2-tier system applying only to new hires. With state leaders taking this position, how does change occur? Again, I hate to put this on you, Susan, but it sounds like you may be.
Well, it's politics, and it's a primary, and Democratic voters are going to have to choose based on, what the Democratic primary candidates offer up. I'm not in agreement with that, and I think that it's sort of, I like Dan Hines a lot, but I think that is an easy way out to get votes. And we have to be very careful. We can't just say no to a 2-tiered system without offering up any other plan. And Illinois is really at a crossroads now. If we don't do something, I mean it, this year or at the very latest the following year, we can't continue to go out to borrow money to make our pension payments. That's what we're doing. We're actually borrowing money to make our pension payments, and that's without paying that's just the basic payment. So I think it's them. I think a lot of this is based on leadership, and good leadership will have to make tough decisions. No, we're all friends here, but I think we're really more in agreement than not. It's, I'm 60 years old almost, and to retire at 50 years old with a full pension or 75% is really, I don't know many, in the business world where you have that kind of a situation. So we have to be fair to everybody in the state. We have to be fair to the taxpayers, we have to be fair to the police and the fire, and we can't quit being political about it because unfortunately the state has done that for too long, and that's why we're in the situation we're in.
Well, I was just going to add to that. I think, we have to be careful, like I said before, not to get too hung up on this two-tiered system because we don't know what it's going to look like, number one. And one of the earlier questions was, what is the negative to that? I really don't know if there is a negative because if you're a young applicant coming into a job, you know what the pension is before you sign up. And if you're not in agreement with it, you just don't take the job. So I don't know if there really is a negative. But I don't want to, I just want to make sure that all the current people know this is not affecting their current pensions or the people that are employed right now as police and firemen. It would have no effect on them. It would just be the inbound new candidates.
I mean, if you don't act, at some point you're going to hit the breaking point, and I don't know where that is. But certainly there were plenty of examples in the private sector over the last 2 years. Look at the UAW, where it hit the breaking point, and people were probably sorry that we didn't take this up 10 years ago or 20 years ago and try and fix the problem. So, it's hard with politicians because they're elected and they're there for the near term and not for the long term. And I think it's, rare to have, unfortunately right now, politicians like Susan who are trying to look at the long term. We certainly have a history of kicking the can down the road in this country. We're doing it in Washington and we're doing it at the state level, and we've got to stop.
I think what Alderman Grimhouse just said is very true, though. I think if you looked at it, the situation, if this was a single employer, maybe working with their own company or whatever, you'd have an opportunity to sit down and say, this doesn't make sense. When you take it the way it's constructed right now on a state level, we have to pull the entire General Assembly together and get them to agree on anything. And anytime you have to get 100 and some people to agree or more, obviously that's difficult. So, the system obviously is in some need of reform, and I think that's the whole bottom line of what we're trying to get to here. Let me try another question here, which is, what % of police and fire retirees continue to work elsewhere after retirement from Lake Forest? The second part of this question is, do retirees receive payments that increase year to year, like Social Security? I don't know, Mike, do you have
Yes, there is a cost of living increase that goes in after a member retires. Quite a few members do retire and work at different jobs. And I'll tell you, the main reason is the medical insurance. As you all know, it's a huge burden. And again, they're not able to collect Social Security. This is their sole source of income. And basically, I don't know the numbers or the figures. I can't give you a percentage of how many police or firemen, leave and go on to a second career. It does happen. It probably happens quite a bit. But again, they're relying on the pension as just their sole income. And the other thing, the reason why, to most of us sitting here saying, well, God, I wish I could retire at 50. I'm turning 50 this year. I wish I could retire at half my pay too. But this is a young man's job. What these firemen and policemen do is a young man's job. Beyond 50, I'm not saying they can't do it, but the strains physically on them and what is demanded of them, it really is a lot. And I think that's why that figure originally was put into place. Now again, bringing up the bad word again, the two-tier system, if we were to move that out to 55, maybe that could be done now because people are taking better care of themselves. These policemen and firemen in this town are physically fit. They have fitness programs. So things are a little different from when these laws were first enacted. So maybe they can be tweaked. But the bottom line is that it's a very difficult job, and it takes a lot of stress, and that's why those age limits are put into place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, really, this will be our last question as we're getting to our allotted time. This one intrigued me. Do Lake Forest employees contribute into Medicare, and are they part of the Medicare system? If not, what is the accrued post-retirement and medical liabilities for Lake Forest employees? How is it funded? Does anyone have a,
We really need Kathy for that one.
that's a tough one, yeah, I didn't know if we had the answer up here.
Well, if you work, you contribute
You
to
contribute.
Medicare, but what you're talking about, ultimately, it comes, I mean, if you're 65 years old, you're able to get Medicare benefits.
I'm not sure. I know that, it's my understanding that there is no
Oh.
that when you retire, you.
Mary, could you grab the mic, I guess?
Yeah,
we can-
it's my understanding
Thank
that
you.
when you retire, you have to pay for your health care costs. So part of the question, I believe, was if there were any continuing costs,
Is
Mayor?
this with just fire and
It- Yeah,
police?
it's
Oh.
a pretty broad-based question.
Oh,
I guess
okay.
they're trying to understand, and it says Lake
Well-
Forest employees, but I think we're talking about police and fire.
Okay,
So we got the issue of police and fire, pensions, and then we have Medicare, and I think,
but I want to add on to that, because I think, and Mike, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, when these pensions were negotiated years ago, what kind of a system you were going to go with, whether it would be Social Security or just a pure pension system, wasn't that a decision that was made? There was sort of a vote taken, because I know that's the way it was done with the teachers. The teachers don't have Social Security either, but that was a decision on their part, I believe. So I always wondered, why not go back into Social Security?
Well, I know, I actually became a police officer in Lake Forest in 1981, and I was one of the last groups that was hired at that time that paid into both our pension plan and Social Security. So at that time, we had a double whammy of what was coming out of our checks. And that law was changed probably 2 or 3 years after I started, where they just solely went into the individual pension plans. And whether that was, it wasn't a vote on the local level.
No,
I don't know
it wasn't,
how
but
that division was made. But to answer the other question about the Medicare, I really don't know if the firemen, and maybe Bob can answer that, if they pay into Medicare. I know they do not pay into Social Security.
We do pay 1.45% of our salary into Medicare. We are entitled to Medicare at age 65. But like they've said, we do not receive any insurance coverage from the city. We can stay insured with the city, but we pay the entire premium cost. And right now, for a single plus one, husband and wife, you're looking at over $23,000 just for your medical insurance. Doesn't include dental.
okay, but they do pay into Medicare at,
Yes,
At
we
it-
do pay 1.45%
okay.
of our salary.
okay. Thank you. Well, this does conclude our time this evening, and first of all, I want to thank Alderman David Grumhouse for all of his efforts this evening. I know he put a lot of effort into his presentation and trying to get to the bottom of how this whole system works, which is very complex. Certainly, State Senator Susan Garrett, thank you for flying all the way in from California, for being with us here this evening, and then for getting back in the car and driving down to Springfield again tomorrow. And we thank you for all your efforts. Mike Cavey from the Police Pension Board, and Mary Tominac from the Fire Pension Board. And again, thank you for everyone coming out this evening. We hope that this has been informative. We hope that you were educated, and we hope that you better understand the issue that we're presenting to you on February 2nd. Thank you.